So I thought this would be a little more obvious that since my topic is hell, right? Also, that way anybody who disagrees with me of what I teach, I'll already look like I'm there, right? Because these things go out on YouTube, all the little hate comments that come in, so you'll be like, yeah, that's where he's going to be, yeah. But anyway, we're going to talk about, I chose this topic for a couple of reasons. The first reason I chose this topic is because that here at ODM, we don't talk about this very often, and we oftentimes get criticized for that. They say, well, you never talk about sin, which is not true, because I have given a sermon on sin and what I believe sin to be, and then people are like, well, you never talk about hell. Well, we just don't believe in dangling you over the fires of hell to scare you into behaving yourselves, right? So we're gonna also take a look at this for another reason. I was raised as an evangelical fundamentalist, right? The old, hellfire and brimstone kind of stuff. I went to private schools all my life. I think the school was called Hell for Certain School. I'm not sure, right? We talked about hell all the time. Every week we talked about it, right? We'd scare the little 5-year-olds. I can remember being very young, and it's like, oh, you told a lie. You know what happens to liars? Yeah, they go to hell. Do you want to go to hell? No, I don't want to go. Well, then you better tell the truth, right? And I can remember how much emphasis was placed upon hell week after week in school. And a lot of my friends who grew up with me in the evangelical fundamentalist community, right, have now sort of turned their backs on it. And I'm seeing right now within the Christian church, there's a lot of talking about sort of fundamentalism and what it all is and whether it's still working as a viable model and a viable viewpoint for Christianity. I see so many of my friends who raised as fundamentalists have now turned their back not only on fundamentalism, but have turned their back on the church, and even worse, have walked away from God. Nothing is worse than when somebody says, everything I taught, I can't believe anymore, and they walk away from God. That's one of the worst things. So I think it's important that we re-examine a lot of what we were taught as we grew up and begin to make our faith our own. Whatever we believe, you need to be studying it. You need to be thinking about it. Just because you may have been taught one thing or the other thing, you shouldn't just take it at face value. You should always study it for yourself and make your own decisions about it. Later, I'm going to tell you my opinion about hell, and you don't have to agree with it. I don't want you to agree with it. I don't want you to agree with it just because I say it. I want you to go home and study it and think about it. All right, Roger, give me the next slide if you could. Here we go. Here's a short history of the afterlife. We're going to talk about where some of our concepts of hell came from and how they came about. Give you a little history lesson here. Of course, Christianity came from Judaism, right? We have Jewish roots. And it might surprise you that in our Jewish roots, they never really talked about hell that much. In fact, they almost never talked about it. They were more concerned about living this present life and how you behaved and what you did and how you treated people in this present life than worrying about what happens after you're dead. The present was much more important. The afterlife for people who followed in the Jewish faith was not very clearly defined. In fact, you can read through a lot of their ancient writings, you can read through the Talmud and the Mishnah, and you're not going to find a clearly defined concept of hell. So what did they have? Give me the next one there. They had a word in Hebrew called Sheol, which literally means the grave. And it was more about a state of just being dead. It was sort of equivalent to the idea of the Greek underworld. It was sort of this misty, dim, kind of dry, empty land that you just went to. You were just dead. And most of the time, if you were in Sheol, you spent the majority of your time just sleeping. And that's why oftentimes you'll find in the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, when they talk about people who've died, they say, those who sleep. Because it's this idea of the grave, this idea of Sheol. Back it up one more. Okay? Both the righteous and the unrighteous went to Sheol. There was no differentiation between, the righteous people go one place and the unrighteous people go the other place. Everybody went to the same place. It was, like I said, a dim, silent twilight world where the dead are insubstantial shades. You had no physical body. You were just sort of like spirits or like ghosts almost. And you are spent most of your time in silence and sleeping. Give me the next one. Here's an artist's rendition of Sheol, what it would be like if you looked like it. So give me the next one. Okay. Oh, this is kind of an interesting thing. You can find this image all over the place. It's an idea of what our ancient Jewish forefathers believed the universe was like. And you can take a look at it there. You can see heaven up above. That's where God lives. You can see the waters above the firmament. That's sort of above the sky. You can see the firmament, which would be where the stars and the sun and all that kind of stuff's at. And then you see the earth there. And on the sides there, you see the pillars of heaven that hold up heaven. Those are the mountains. Okay, you see the great ocean there and the pillars of the earth that go down into the ocean. But if you look underground, this is where they believe Sheol was. That, like in a lot of the cartoons that we watch on TV or perhaps in the theaters long, long ago, that if you dug down deep enough, you would hit the land of the dead, right? So that's where they believe Sheol was. And then even below Sheol was one more place. It was the abyss. This was a later idea that began to come in, that if you were especially bad, you went to the abyss. But everybody else just kind of went to Sheol. Give me the next slide there. So continuing with our short history of the afterlife with our Jewish roots here, when the Hebrew Tanakh, which is what we call the Old Testament, was translated to Greek, they chose the word Hades to translate it to Greek because Sheol and the idea of Hades were the two closest concepts that they had. And if you guys are familiar with the Greek idea of Hades, again, that's sort of this twilight underworld where you just kind of go and you're not really doing anything there. It was the thing that was closest in conceptual meaning. Later, Sheol was compartmentalized. They divided it up. In what was called the Second Temple period, they said, well, is it really that the righteous and unrighteous both just go to a grave? Is there something else there? And so they divided it, that the righteous would go to one section of Sheol and the unrighteous would go to another section. They didn't mingle. Of course, it was still exactly the same for you, whether you're righteous or unrighteous. You just kind of were silent and slept. There wasn't really, you got rewards and punishments. That idea hadn't come out yet. But they did say, well, let's just at least separate them. We'll make them in two different departments. Give me the next one. So by the time that we get to Jesus' time in the New Testament, okay, the Second Temple period, they had developed this new idea, the Jewish teaching of the bosom of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, oftentimes just shortened to the bosom of Abraham. The idea was, well, the unrighteous kind of go to Sheol over there, and the righteous go to the bosom of Abraham. And then the idea began to develop that the righteous are held in this special section where Abraham is the guardian. So, sort of the Jewish equivalent of St. Peter guarding the gates is Abraham guarding the gates. And it was a special section where he was the guardian. And in between these two sections, where the righteous and unrighteous went, was a large chasm that separated the two. And sometimes it wasn't a chasm, sometimes it was a river. And there was a ferryman that could take you across the river. Except it wasn't the river Styx, and it wasn't Charon, the ferryman. It was an angel who could take you across the river into the bosom of Abraham. By the way, if you take a look at the picture there, that's an old painting there. You'll see there's Abraham in the middle, and he's flanked by Isaac and Jacob. And you see these little figures, these little heads in their lap. Those are the souls of people in the bosom of Abraham. So this is how it began to get presented. Give me the next one. So by Jesus' time, there was this idea of the bosom of Abraham. In fact, it's asked about it. Jesus tells a parable, and he uses this phrase, the bosom of Abraham. Let's take a look at it. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. And the rich man also died and was buried in Hades, where he was being tormented. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." Next. But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us," he said. "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." And he said to him, "If you do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." So by the time we get to the New Testament period, this Second Temple period, by the time of Jesus, not only do we have separation in Sheol, where we have the righteous on one side in the bosom of Abraham and the unrighteous on the other side, but now the unrighteous are being tormented with flame. So you can begin to see this is sort of the proto-development of our ideas that we have about hell now. Give me the next slide. Then Lazarus, for I am suffering in these great flames, would look more like this. The next one. Okay. So by Jesus' time, the Pharisees began to teach that the soul was immortal. Now, this was a unique concept because in the early Jewish faith, they didn't believe in an immortal soul. They believed that at the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve sinned by eating of the tree of the knowledge of good or evil, and God said, surely you will die, they didn't die physically right then and there, but how they died was they lost their immortality. And so that no souls were immortal, that everybody, including our soul, was mortal. But the Pharisees, who were considered the religious liberals of their time, which is kind of shocking, the Pharisees believed in a bodily resurrection, that the righteous would go to Sheol for a while, and then later they would be physically resurrected. Of course, the opposing group to them was the Sadducees, who did not agree with this. Okay, the Sadducees denied bodily resurrection or the immortality of the soul as well. They believed you went to the grave and that was it, you're done. There was nothing that came beyond that. This is pointed out by Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs, who died in 2006, one of the best Jewish scholars out there. Give me the next slide. Again, Jesus sort of affirmed this kind of idea because one of the Sadducees came to Jesus talking about the idea of resurrection, and he was sort of making this ad absurdum argument about it. So the same day, some Sadducees came to him saying, there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses says that if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same, so also the third, down to the 7th. And last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection then, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her. So the Sadducees were sort of making fun of this. They're like, yeah, there is a bodily resurrection. What about this? This guy's going to end up with 7 wives, and who wants that? So they were testing Jesus to see if he followed along with the teachings of the Pharisees and taught physical resurrection as well. Give me the next slide. And Jesus answered them, you're wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astounded by his teaching. So Jesus supported the idea of bodily, physical resurrection. So by Jesus' time, we have the idea of there's a place for the righteous and a place for the unrighteous. That the righteous are rewarded and the unrighteous are punished. And that there will be a physical resurrection. Next slide. You can see with this little chart here how the idea of Sheol began to develop into the current ideas that we have of heaven and hell. How many of you have seen the pictures of heaven and hell and there's a great chasm between the two, right? And oftentimes you'll see a cross overlaid between the two, won't you? Okay. Well, it comes from the ancient idea of Sheol from the Jews. Next slide. This is a picture off of the top stone, the capital of a column, from the Middle Ages. By the Middle Ages, this idea of the bosom of Abraham became equivalent with the idea of heaven. So that when they said heaven or the bosom of Abraham, we understood it to mean the same thing. You can see a picture of Abraham there, and once again, in his lap, he's got little figurines which represent men's souls. Give me the next picture. And there's another one there from a cathedral. And again, there's Abraham, and he's flanked by a bunch of angels on both sides, and he's got souls there in his bosom. So this idea of the bosom of Abraham became our idea of heaven. Okay, next. Now, New Testament hell. Well, let's talk about all the words we translate as hell. They actually use several different words, and we oftentimes will just translate them out as hell, although they actually do represent different things. Hades is the equivalent of Sheol, because it's the same idea, it's the same concept. So when you see the word Hades in Greek, They're really talking about the grave and this concept of just sort of this dim, silent twilight land where everybody sleeps, not necessarily a hell full of fire and brimstone. The other word is Tartarus that you might see, and that would be the equivalent to the pit that I showed you in the previous picture, where really, really bad people go. Okay, it's the punishment section of Sheol. And then finally, Gehenna. You'll see Gehenna oftentimes translated out as hell. Okay, and it was considered a cursed land, and we often translate that out as hell. Gehenna is the equivalent of the Valley of Hinnom, or the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom. Give me the next slide. I think I have a picture. Yeah, there it is. If you ever wanted to see what Gehenna or hell looks like, there it is. It was kind of a unique place. Gehenna is where King Ahaz actually did human sacrifice, and so the land was considered cursed. So the idea of Gehenna being a cursed land and an evil land and a place where bodies were burned became sort of their idea of this of hell. Here's the passage here from 2 Chronicles. Ahaz was 21 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his ancestor David had done. But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made cast images for the Baals. And he made offerings in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, which we now call Gehenna, and made his sons pass through the fire. That would be the fire of Moloch, where they did human sacrifice and offered infant children to Moloch by burning them. Sons passed through the fire according to the abominational practices of the nations, whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. He sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. So in the Jewish mindset, when you said Gehenna, they're thinking of this cursed land, a land of being away from God, this land of fire, this land of death. And so in their mind, when you say Gehenna, that's what you're thinking about. Give me the next slide there. Ah, yes, the ever-famous lake of fire, okay, or in Greek, the limina tou poros, the lake of fire. How many of you have heard that you're going to be cast into the lake of fire? Yeah. Well, if you want to see a picture of the lake of fire, there it is. Okay? The lake of fire, and we see some references to that in Revelation. That's mostly where you see the New Testament revelations. Anybody recognize the picture? It's the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea had a nickname as the Lake of Fire. And the reason why is because in Jewish tradition, in Jewish folklore and mythology, or however you want to think about it, they believed that the site of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain were there, where the Dead Sea is now. And so it was called or nicknamed the Lake of Fire because Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by fire and brimstone. And so in their mind, the Lake of Fire is a place of punishment. But there it is. If you've never seen the Lake of Fire, there it is. So again, this idea of Gehenna and this idea of the Lake of Fire tend to be more metaphorical in meaning, tend to be ideas of punishment rather than actual physical places. But we'll move on a little bit more with that. Give me the next slide. So the idea began to develop in early New Testament times that it sort of worked this way, that there was Sheol, that when you died, you would go to Sheol and you'd be asleep for a while, and then there was a resurrection and you'd be judged, and then you'd either be sent to heaven or hell. And that was what the early church kind of began to teach. And Paul seemed to have supported this. If you look in 1 Corinthians, he writes, "Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep," sort of supporting the idea that there's this kind of waiting place before we go. "But we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will all be changed." So Paul was supporting not only a place of sleep, but also this idea of physical resurrection and then moving on to the reward or punishment after judgment. So you can begin to see how these ideas are beginning to evolve over time, and we're getting to where we're at now. But there is a problem, okay? And it's on the next slide. Oh, sorry. You can see this idea of sleep as well in the early Apostles' Creed. The idea in the early church was that Jesus, when he was in the tomb for the 3 days, that he actually descended into, and it says here, hell, but the word would be Sheol, that supposedly Jesus went to Sheol and preached to the people there and brought them liberation. That was an idea within the early church. And that he will come back to judge the living and the dead. So not only the people living on the earth, but the people who are in Sheol after he resurrected. Okay, give me the next slide. Okay? The problem with it now is that we're not quite sure how it all works together because we've sort of eliminated this idea of Sheol. We don't really think of that, oh, well, there's this resting place or this sleeping place where you wait. Because right now we're teaching that, well, as soon as you die, immediately you go to heaven or immediately you go to hell. But that creates some problem, right? Because you have life, you have death, and then you have heaven or hell. Where's the resurrection come in and where's the judgment come in? And so I've heard a lot of different theories about this. I was listening to some preacher on YouTube the other day, and he's saying, well, what's going to happen is this. You're going to live, you're going to die, you're either going to go to heaven or hell, and then when Jesus comes back, he's going to resurrect you out of those places so that he can throw you back into hell or send you back to heaven. And I'm like, well, that's an awful lot of work, isn't it? You know, here, come on out of hell so I can give you a new body. Now back you go. Okay, it was great. Nice. We're not quite sure how it works. And that's really bothersome for some people. I mean, wouldn't you be a little bit bothered if it's like, well, what happens when I die? And they have to look at you and say, well, we really don't know. Be like, what? But you're supposed to tell me. Now, there are a lot of people who tell you they have the answers, but if you begin to question them on all of this, they're going to be like, well, I'm not exactly sure how it works, but I'm sure it works out somehow. Okay. Give me the next slide. The big question that I think that should be on our minds is, what is the nature of hell? What is hell like? What's its purpose? Don't you think that's a good question? If some people are going to go to hell, what's hell going to be like and what is its purpose? Why is there a hell? Why did God create a hell? What's the purpose of it? Next slide. Go ahead and do that. Most of the ideas that we have about hell come from this gentleman here. And if you recognize him, this is Dante Alighieri. Okay? He's the writer of the Divine Comedy, which is 3 different books, but the one that mostly affects how we view hell nowadays is Dante's Inferno. A lot of the ideas that we have about hell come from Dante's Inferno, all the demons and the punishments and all that kind of fire and brimstone and all that. It mostly comes from him, from his writings in the Middle Ages. But Dante wasn't in the Bible, and yet we take a lot of our ideas about hell from him. Give me the next slide. Let's take a look at what our early fathers believed. Now, in the early church, there were 6 large schools, actual universities, and they would teach theology and philosophy, and many of them also taught medicine as well. And at these 6 large Christian universities across the vast empire, who taught theology, you can see them here, the School of Alexandria, the School of Antioch, the School of Caesarea, Edessa, Nisibis. The reason that they're put together is that all the teachers from Edessa all quit and went to the other university. Of course, they had to. They were being invaded at the time. So Ephesus, the school at Ephesus, and of course the school at Carthage, which later all moved to Rome. The school at Carthage moved up and packed up and went to Rome. So there were 6 great schools of theology throughout the Christian empire. And what did they believe? What did they teach? What did they say hell was like? What did they say was the nature of hell? And if you give me the next slide, you'll see it here. 4 of the 6 schools taught what we now call universalism. One of the schools taught conditional immortality, or what we now call annihilationism. And one of the schools taught the concept of eternal punishment. Okay? So what do each of these schools represent? Let's take a look at it. Give me the next slide. For the first 5 centuries of the church, the doctrine of universal reconciliation was the predominant view. Now, universal reconciliation is the doctrine that all sinful and alienated human souls, because of divine love and mercy, will ultimately be reconciled to God. The nature of hell is redemptive, not retributive. For the first 5 centuries, the predominant view of hell was this, that hell was a place of discipline, not punishment. That you would go to hell until you could accept Christ. And once you did, you were free from hell. They believed that God's mercy and God's love reached even past the gates of hell and could bring people out of it. And that was the predominant view for the first 5 centuries. Give me the next slide. You can see here, it can be supported scripturally if you wanted to. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to me. And you'll notice there's not any kind of exclusion there, that all people will be reconciled. So there are a lot of biblical references that will support this universalist view. Next slide. Annihilationism was a different view, and only one school really taught that. That was the school at Ephesus. It was a very Greek idea. Annihilationism has always been a minority view, but even today is considered a non-heretical doctrinal position. The Seventh-day Adventists teach annihilationism. Anybody who comes out of the Millerite schools teaches annihilationism. One of the best Christian writers out there and a great theologian, John Stott, supports annihilationism. Okay? So it's considered a viable alternative. It's a belief that apart from salvation, the final punishment of human beings results in their total destruction or annihilation rather than their everlasting torment. Hell is seen as non-existence. They believe in the idea of conditional immortality. If you remember, we talked about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and that their death was they lost their immortality. The idea behind annihilationism is this, that if you don't turn to Christ, then God does not grant you immortality, and you simply cease to exist. And that hell is non-existence. Give me the next slide. Here's a verse from Psalms. But the wicked perish, and the enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures. They vanish. Like smoke, they vanish away. And so you can actually find scriptures that will support this point of view. Next slide. Eternal torment. Eternal torment, which was taught out of the Church of Carthage, Rome, was a minority position until 533 AD. It is now the view predominantly taught. So most of you were probably raised and taught that if you die and you have not heard of Jesus or given your life to Jesus, that you're going to hell and you'll be tormented forever. How many of you were taught that? It is the predominant view since the 6th century. It's a belief that apart from salvation, the final punishment of human beings results in being tormented for eternity. Hell is seen as retributive punishment for sins. So it's not rehabilitative, it's retributive. You're being punished because you are a sinner. And I'm sure many of you have heard a sermon on that before. Okay? There are a lot of people who feel that this particular doctrine became the predominant doctrine because it came out of the Church of Rome, and Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so, of course, they aligned with their own theological school rather than one of the other ones. Well, could be. Next slide. And again, you can find verses to support this. Here in Matthew, you'll see, have you heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment? But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. So the point that I'm trying to make with all this, give me the next slide, is, which one's scriptural? It depends. See, you can take eternal torment, and there's a whole list of verses that will support that viewpoint. You can take annihilationism, and there's a whole list of verses that will support that viewpoint. You can take universalism, and there's a whole list of verses that support that viewpoint. And if we were really, really honest with you in the pulpit, we would tell you, we don't know which one is the correct one. See, because whereas I believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, whereas I believe in the infallibility of the Bible, I don't believe man's interpretation of the Bible is inerrant and infallible. We have a tendency to mess it up. And so you could take any of these positions and probably be equally as right or equally as wrong. So it's going to come down to this. When you approach Scripture and you're reading it with the Holy Spirit, what does the Holy Spirit say to you? Because you're going to have to make a choice. And the choice that you make is going to kind of decide how you spend your life, isn't it? And what you do in this life. Oh, so we're going to go back to the Jewish idea that what we do in this life is more important than what happens in the afterlife? Since we don't know what's going to happen in the afterlife, what we do here and now and how we relate to people here and now is the most important thing. Give me the next slide. I just want to remind you here at Open Door Ministries, right? We call ourselves open and affirming. Open and affirming. that not only relates to the issue of the LGBT, right, but it also relates to doctrinal issues, right? That wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we are here to help you, right, as you pursue Jesus. One of the first things that you're going to read in all our church and corporation documents is that we are Christ-centered and biblically based. Christ-centered. We are Jesus-centric around here. And there's a lot of doctrines that we can discuss, and there's a lot of doctrines we can agree on, and a lot of doctrines we can disagree on, but you know what? We're just going to keep chasing after Jesus. We're just going to keep pursuing him. And we believe around here that if you just keep pursuing Jesus, you'll get to where you need to be. I don't care if you're a pre-tribulationist or a post-tribulationist or a mid-tribulationist. I don't care if you're a premillennial, post-millennial, amillennial. Just keep chasing Jesus. Okay? I don't care if you're a universalist, an annihilationist, or somebody who believes in eternal torment. Just keep chasing Jesus. Let's focus on this life, here and now, and not worry too much about the afterlife. That Jesus will get us to where we need to be, wherever that's going to be where we go. You are not saved by doctrine. You're saved by Jesus. It's interesting. I'm taking classes online right now, right? I'm taking some online classes. I'm working on another master's degree, this time in Christian history. Because, master's degree, you can never have enough of them, right? You always got to have another one, right? They're like potato chips. Let's get another one, right? Right? And it's interesting because since it's an online class, I have to have small group meetings online. We do them Skype, So we're all talking to each other. And the people that I'm assigned with in my small group, I'm the oldest one in the group, right? It's always nice to be the oldest one in college. Thank you, right? It's kind of unusual, I'm not the teacher this time, I'm the student, so that's kind of unusual for me. It's like, I get to see the other side of this again. I have to remember what it's like to be a student, right? But in my small group, the two other people who are in it with me, they're working on their doctorates of ministry. I'm working on my doctorate of, they're working on their master's of ministry. I'm working on my master's in theology, Christian history. So I'm coming from a different perspective than they are. One of them is going to be an army chaplain. One of them wants to be a missionary to South Africa. So one's going to be a chaplain, one's going to be a missionary. And here's me. They're like, well, what are you planning to do? And I'm like, I'm just planning to stand around and talk about this stuff, I'm an academic. I just talk about it. I don't actually have to go out. I don't do anything. I just talk, okay? Right? Don't ask me to do anything, right? Right? So, but I was listening to the guy who's planning to be an army chaplain, and he was so full of fear, and he was so full of anxiety as I was listening to him, because he's just like, I'm so worried that I'm going to teach wrong doctrine. I'm so worried that I'm going to teach wrong doctrine. And I'm like, relax, dude. We're not saved by doctrine. We're saved by Jesus. And you could just see the look on his face like I had just kicked him or something and said some terrible heresy, How can you say that? It's all about doctrine. And it's like, no, it's not. It's all about Jesus, right? Let's just stay focused on Jesus. All right, give me the next slide. Now, WWRCD, okay? In my classes, my students sometimes get together and they create little buttons that they give to everybody as sort of like the survivorship kind of thing. The first button they ever made was, I survived RC's class. And they were all wearing that one. Now they have a new button, it's WWRCD. What would RC do in this interpreting situation, right? What would he do? So people are always asking me, well, RC, what do you believe? Now, just because I believe it doesn't make it right. It just means it's what I choose to believe. You need to do the study and work yourself and decide what you choose to believe. But I'll share with you what I choose to believe. I choose to believe the doctrine of evangelical universalism. Now, we talked about universalism, and evangelical universalism is one of the flavors available to you, right? There's all kinds of universalism. There's all kinds of annihilationism. There's all kinds of eternal torment varieties or flavors, as you will. And I choose for evangelical universalism, and I'll tell you why. Okay? I choose to believe that hell actually does exist. I believe in hell. I believe that hell does exist, and that it's a place of discipline and rehabilitation. That it calls all people, all of mankind, back to God. That hell serves a purpose other than just punishment and torment. That it serves a purpose to call men back to God. I choose to believe that ultimately that God will triumph and reconcile all things back to him. I believe that Christ triumphs. Give me the next one. Okay, there are several reasons why. One is linguistically. I have this quote here from William Barclay, one of the most brilliant Bible scholars you'll ever had. He did his own translation of the New Testament called the Barclay Translation. In fact, if you've ever heard a preacher preach, you've probably heard them copying off of William Barclay. Okay? William Barclay wrote a commentary to the New Testament, and it's freely lifted by a lot of preachers, and you'll hear a lot of his ideas in sermons today, right? But this is what he says. He says one of the key passages is Matthew 25:46, where it is said that the rejected go to eternal punishment. And that word is important, eternal punishment, and the righteous to eternal life. The Greek word for punishment is kolossos, which is not originally an ethical word at all. It originally meant the pruning of trees to make them grow better. I think it is true to say that in all Greek secular literature, kolossos is never used of anything but remedial punishment. The word for eternal is aionios. It means more than everlasting. For Plato, who may have invented the word, plainly says that a thing may be everlasting and still not be aionios. The simplest way to out it is that aionios cannot be used properly of anything but God, because only God is eternal. It is the word uniquely, as Plato saw it, of God. So, aionios kolossos is then literally the kind of remedial punishment it benefits God to give, and which only God can give. See, you can translate these Greek words one way and say eternal punishment, or you can translate them the other way and say that it is God's discipline. There's a vast difference between those two ideas. And how you choose to interpret that Greek is going to say something about what you believe about hell, and more importantly, what you believe the purpose of hell is. Give me the next slide. The other reason that I believe in evangelical universalism is because of the character of God. Not only is God loving, not only is God merciful, but God is a God of justice. And I want you to work through this one with me here. Take a look at this verse here. It's from Leviticus. Really? Leviticus? Yeah. Okay. Anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. Now, a lot of times when we say, an eye for an eye, we think that we have some kind of right to retribution. But in the Old Testament times, when God set down this law, it was a law of justice. Because in the Old Testament times, the Jewish people and all the other nations around them and the tribes, they practiced sort of the, how would I describe it? How many people have seen the movie Untouchables with Kevin Costner and Sean Connery? Okay, right? You remember what Sean Connery tells them? Right? He says, if they come at you with a knife, you come at them with a gun. And if they put one of your guys in the hospital, you put 3 of their guys in the morgue. Okay? And the Old Testament Jews and the tribes and the nations around them, that's the kind of justice that they practice. You kill one of our guys, we put 5 of yours in the grave. That's the way it works. And this was God saying, no, that the punishment and the crime must fit each other, that you can't go over and above what your injury was. And so he was maintaining a system of justice with this teaching here. And then by the time you get to Jesus, Jesus quotes about this. He says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to anyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Jesus says this idea of retribution, no. It's not about retribution. So in the Old Testament, it was about justice, a fair retribution. And by the time you get to Jesus, it's no retribution. God is not retributive, but he's a God of justice. Now let's stop and think about this for a second. Is it justice to send someone for eternal torment for the temporary years that they misbehaved on this world? Your life, what, 80, 90, 100 years? Is it justice? Is it really an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth to send you to eternal torment? To me, that doesn't seem fair, and so it doesn't match up to the character of God in my mind. And like I talked about when I talked about the Bible, we need to interpret all Scripture in light of Jesus and his character. And I'm looking at Jesus here, and I'm not seeing retribution. But I do see discipline. I do see rehabilitation. I do see reconciliation, that the ultimate goal is always reconciliation. What reconciliation happens in eternal torment? None. Give me the next slide. The final reason why is because I like the fact that Jesus is triumphant. He said to Peter, that, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Savior, and on that rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I like to believe that Jesus as Savior, not even the gates of hell can stand against his love and his mercy and his grace. It takes the cross and it makes it the central point of all eternity. That the work done by the cross, the atonement, becomes so powerful that not even the gates of hell can stand against it. That it can literally reach into hell and call men back. The atonement and the work of the cross become the most significant and powerful force of all time. It makes Jesus triumphant. God is both willing and able to accomplish his purposes through the cross. And I really like this phrase about being both willing and able. There are huge theological schools that you can join. If you are an Arminian, you believe that not everybody's going to heaven, and the reason why is because God is not able to bring everybody to heaven. See, that man's free will is so powerful that God, even in all of his sovereignty, can't work with it to reconcile men to him, that men will choose to be there. So God is not able to save everybody in Arminianism. And if you're a Calvinist, God is not willing to save everybody. That he's picked certain special people, yea, for these people, and all the rest of you, you're going to hell. That's what I decided. And he's not willing to save everybody. But I choose to believe in evangelical universalism because it allows God to be both willing and able. That in this life, if you can shed your false self, in this life, if you can shed your ego, if you can put off the old man and put on the new man, if you can allow yourself to be transformed into new creation, you're not going to pass through the fires of hell. This earth becomes your hell. But if in this life you cannot shed your false self, if you cannot shed your ego, if you cannot put off the old man and take on the new man, if you cannot allow yourself to be transformed, you will pass through the fires of refinement. You will pass through the fires until you bow your knee. Because as it says, every knee will bow, every knee, and every tongue confess. Now there's some things about about evangelical universalism that some people don't like. They're like, are you telling me that one day Hitler might walk out of hell? And the answer is yeah. I believe it's true. That if he can finally shed his ego and his false self and all his justifications and his self-righteousness and his ideas, that he can. But that leaves Christ triumphant. How powerful is the work of atonement that it can reach even him? Osama bin Laden? Yeah. Oh, I think they're going to be there a long time. I think it's going to take a long time for men of that much evil to shed their false selves and their egos, to take off the old man and take on. I think they're going to be there a long time. And of course, the question is always, what about Satan? Can he walk out of hell? And the answer is yeah. How powerful is Christ that he can even redeem the demonic? How powerful is he that he can even reach him? I have a feeling that if Satan ever comes out of hell, he'll be the last one out. There's a lot to shed. There is a lot that he's going to have. If his original sin was that he would not bow his knee and that he coveted the throne of God, it's going to take a lot to get him to bow that knee. But I believe that Christ is ultimately triumphant in all things, and he will reconcile everything back to him. That's what I choose to believe. Next slide. C.S. Lewis, great writer, he agrees with me. Okay, let me restate that. I agree with C.S. Lewis. All right, I agree with C.S. Lewis. He doesn't agree with me. I agree with C.S. Lewis. You know, he wrote this great book. It's called The Great Divorce, right? It's sort of a pun title. It's William Blake, the poet, wrote a poem called The Marriage Between Heaven and Hell. And C.S. Lewis talked about the Great Divorce. It's a fascinating story. The narrator of the story just wakes up one day and he's on a bus. And when the bus arrives, he finds out that he's arrived at the foothills of heaven. And he looks around at all his fellow passengers and he realizes all these people have gotten on the bus at hell and have taken a bus ride to the foothills of heaven. And they're all insubstantial. They really have no physical, bodily substance to themselves. And as they arrive at the foothills of heaven, people come out to greet them, people that they know. And they spend the rest of the book trying to convince these individuals, look, you can get off of the bus and ascend the foothills of heaven into heaven. It's going to be a very long and painful journey because you're insubstantial right now. But the further you travel and the more you allow God to help you, the more substantial you'll become, and the better and the easier it will be for you to travel. Please get off the bus and come. And every last character on that bus gives justifications and rationalizations. And their pride and their ego get into the way of why they can't get off from the bus and why they need to go back to hell. In his book, The Problem of Pain, he says this: I willingly believe that the damned are, in one sense, successful rebels to the end, that the gates of hell are locked on the inside. So I believe in evangelical universalism, but I don't want you to follow after that because I believe it. I want you to go home and do the hard work yourself. I want you to study this issue. But no matter where we're at on this issue, no matter which one you choose to believe, it all leaves us with the same answer, Jesus. It all leaves us with the same answer that this life here and now is the most important thing that we need to be concerned about, not buying a fire insurance policy for the afterlife.